Chapter 51, Carapace Centurion Shadow Slave. Monsters did possess some rudimentary intelligence, however, they could not compare to humans. At their core, they were still predators who acted mostly on instinct. Their cunning was beastly in nature, and was not that hard to overcome. That gave the three sleepers a chance to leverage their advantage. After finalizing the plan, they made some preparations. While Changing Star was getting ready, Sunny had retrieved the soul shards from the 8 dead scavengers. After delivering them to the silver-haired girl, he watched as she brought them to her chest and crushed them in her fist one after another, absorbing the essence of each shard into her soul core. After a few minutes, when the changes caused by the absorption were over, Nephise opened her eyes and slowly inhaled. To a sleeper, consuming the shards of 8 awakened beasts was equivalent to slaying 16 dormant creatures. While not tremendous, it was still a significant boost in physical ability. Her body had become stronger, faster, enhanced in every way. They were going to need every bit of that strength to survive. Because of how attuned Nephise was to her physicality, getting accustomed to her new limits did not take long. Very soon she looked at him and asked, "Are you ready?" Sunnyside glanced at his shadow, hoping to get some moral support. The shadow pretended to not notice and ignored him. "Disloyal bastard. As ready as I'll ever be." Nephise nodded and turned to Cassie. There was nothing really to say. They had already discussed everything there was to discuss, and empty words could not make the blind girl worry any less. Come to think of it, Sunny wouldn't have wanted to trade places with her, even though out of the 3 of them, she was the only one who didn't have to risk her life in combat. Facing the enemy, no matter how terrifying, was better than wait powerlessly for the outcome, knowing that there's nothing you can do to change it. From that point of view, he was actually the lucky one. Cassie tried to put on a brave face. She turned to Nephise and forced a smile. "Go and kill that thing. Maybe you'll finally get something decent to wear. And stop making me feel so guilty." A corner of Changing Star's lip curled up. "Okay." After that, she turned to Sunny and returned to her usual serious self. "Let's go." A few minutes later, he was standing on top of the rocky ridge, looking down at the deadly monster. The shadow was wrapped around his body, enhancing Sunny's physical abilities. Their plan was pretty solid and high chance of working. However, he still couldn't get rid of the ominous feeling that this was not going to end well. "I don't like this." With a sigh, Sunny raised his hand and summoned the silver bell. Then he lightly shook it, causing the clear melodic ringing to resound. Amidst the storm, immediately the monster below moved, turning its massive torso around and looking for the source of the sudden noise. As he saw Sunny, a mad crimson flame ignited in its eyes. However, Sunny did not see any of this because he was already facing the other way. As soon as the bell rang, he turned around and jumped down from the ridge without a second of hesitation. The ridge wasn't very tall, but there was still a considerable distance to the ground. Sunny hit the rocks hard and rolled, trying to disperse the force of the impact. As soon as he got back to his feet, he ran, trying to get as far away as possible. A moment later, the ridge exploded behind his back. The monster simply crashed into it with its hulking body, breaking through the layers of rocks as though they were paper. Simultaneously, there was a flash of lightning and a thunderclap, drowning the loud rumble of the falling debris. The creature locked onto retreating Sunny and lunged forward, trying to pierce his body with one of its scythes. Shards of rock were flowing like a torrent from its spiked carapace. Luckily, Sunny was already far enough. Without slowing down, he lowered. His body ran for several more meters and then turned around. The picture of the monster, who was more than 3 meters tall, rushing at him like a speeding train, was enough to make any person falter. However, Sunny stood his ground, raising the azure blade above his head. After all, he was the bait. Half a dozen meters away from him, the monster finally reached their trap. Almost unnoticeable in the darkness and the pouring rain, the golden rope was strung between 2 massive boulders at the height of the creature's leg joints. Earlier, Sunny had lowered his body to run beneath it. Overwhelmed by bloodlust, the monster did not notice the tautly drawn rope and ran into it at full speed. If it was a normal rope, it would, without doubt, immediately snap. However, the golden rope was a memory, and being incredibly sturdy was one of its attributes. The rocks it was tied to, unfortunately, were quite mundane. They shattered almost immediately, but the damage was already done. With its front legs suddenly jerked backward, the Scythe Slayer lost its balance and crashed into the ground face, first sliding forward on wet stone, and leaving behind a shallow trench. Sunny jumped away. The monster was unperturbed. Almost immediately, two bone scythes pierced the ground, jerking its massive body to a stop. In the next moment, unexpectedly swift and nimble for its size, it was already beginning to rise. If it was allowed to stand up, their fates would be sealed. Fortunately, Sunny's echo was faster. The moment the monster fell, it stopped pretending to be one of the dead. Scavengers got up and dashed forward. Just as their enemy was about to rise, it jumped on its carapace from behind, pinning the creature down with its weight and locked its pincers on the creature's arms just beneath the point where the bone scythes began. Despite the fact that the echo was wounded by the spikes growing from the monster's carapace, it succeeded in immobilizing it, at least for a second. A second was enough. As though out of nowhere, Nephis, who was lying in ambush, appeared in front of the monster. Darting between its terrifying scythes, she leaned forward and delivered a devastating thrust with her longsword, putting her whole weight behind it. They didn't know if the awakened monster had the same weak spot on its back as its lesser relatives, the scavengers, had. However, there was no reason to assume that there was no gap between its carapace and torso armor. It was a mechanical issue. Anything that had to be flexible could not be too rigid. The tip of Changing Star's sword plunged into the narrow gap. Then the sword disappeared into the monster's body, penetrating so deep that its hilt ended up brushing against the chitin. Hell yes, Sunny thought, triumphant. However, in the next second, his expression dimmed, because the creature didn't even seem to notice the wound that was supposed to be, if not fatal, then at least heavily debilitating. Straining its body a little, it suddenly twisted, throwing the echo off its carapace, and rose to its feet. The bone scythes scraped against the rock as it pulled them out from the ground. Defenseless, Nephis was right in front of it, her sword still stuck in the monster's flesh. Oh no. Sunny was too far away to do anything, circling around the massive creature to attack it from behind. The echo was on the ground, still reeling from being thrown off the enemy's back. It didn't seem like it could help. Either, for the moment, Changing Star was on her own. The scythes pierced the air, aiming for her flesh. At the last moment, however, a pair of pincers locked one of them into an iron grip. That gave Nephis another fraction of a second to react. Letting go of the sword, she dove under the creature's body, hiding in the blind spot of the remaining scythes' attack range. As far as hiding places went, this one wasn't optimal, since all the monster had to do to crush her into a bloody pulp was to lie down. However, in that moment, Nephis had no other choice. This bad. By then, Sunny was already behind the creature, hoping to buy Neph some time. He brandished the azure blade and slashed down. The sword connected with the joint of one of the monster's rear legs, drawing azure blood. However, unlike how it was in the battle against a scavenger, he failed to completely sever the limb. It was too tough and thick. In the next moment, the leg disappeared from Sunny's field of vision. Crap! As that thought appeared in his mind, Sunny raised his head and looked at the monster. Somehow it had already turned around and was now facing him, two crimson flames burning with bloodlust in its eyes. Before Sunny could properly react, the sharp tip of a bone scythe hit him in the chest with the force of a siege ram. The only thing he managed to do was to transfer the shadow from his body to the puppeteer's shroud. Because of this lightning-fast decision, the armor held. He wasn't pierced through the heart and impaled on the scythe. However, it was a small consolation. The force of the blow was still enough to make his ribcage cave in and send his body flying through the air like a rag doll. Somehow, Sunny found himself lying on the ground. His body felt weird and he couldn't breathe. Something bitter was flowing from his mouth, making him choke. It was blood. He was drowning in his own blood. Weakly, Sunny tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't listen to him. Only the shadow listened, enveloping his body and delaying the inevitable a little. I'm hurt. With his thoughts moving slower and slower, as though submerged in a dense fog, he looked up, hoping to see the stars. Instead, he saw two burning crimson eyes approaching him from the darkness. Chapter 52, Clarity, Shadow Slave. In that moment, hovering on the edge of nothingness, Sunny realized that he was about to die. He had to struggle against the fog that permeated his mind, slowing down his thoughts and dampening all emotions, all except for fear. Despite the fact that his body was broken and his mind was paralyzed, some stubborn part of Sunny was still refusing to give up. He wasn't ready to die, at least not without giving his all to survive. He was revolted at the thought of giving the world the satisfaction of the win. That would be so infuriating. Hadn't he told Hero that he was going to Survive no matter what to spite them all. That's right. He might be a shameless liar, but a promise was still a promise. But how was he even supposed to survive? No matter how he looked at it, the situation seemed to be hopeless. As the Scythe Slayer approached, its eyes shining menacingly with bloodthirsty crimson light, Sonny tried to pierce through the fog that enveloped his mind. However, his attempts were aimless and weak. It was hard to find purchase in the fog. He needed an anchor. Suddenly, a simple thought caught his attention. It was something that he had repeated 1,000 times, burning it into his mind. Repetition, experience, clarity. Clarity. He remembered what Nephi's had taught him. The essence of combat was murder. Any action performed during a battle served only one of two purposes. It was either to kill your enemy or prevent the enemy from killing you. If he could learn that, he would have enough clarity to master the mind. Back then, he didn't really understand the profound meaning behind the simple word clarity that Nephi's had used. But now, with his mind in shambles, he was finally able to grasp it. The two truths behind the essence and purpose of combat were simple and solid, almost tangible. Even in his half-conscious state, he was able to use them as a stable foundation in the fog. Then he reformed his mind around this foundation, building it along the stark lines of that truth. Suddenly, he was able to think again. What's more, his thoughts were clear and incredibly fast, free of all unnecessary distractions. This was clarity. Sonny looked up at the advancing monster, calmly weighing his options. His body was pretty much useless. He couldn't move his limbs at all. Shadow still followed his commands, but it was busy doing an important job, keeping him from dying immediately. Even with its help, he wouldn't be able to last long. But this was a useless thought. He couldn't do anything about it, so there was no sense in wasting time considering it further. With his body immobilized, memories couldn't be used. That left only the echo. The carapace scavenger was going to have to be his only tool to either kill the enemy or prevent the enemy from killing him. The monster was quickly approaching Sonny. Its mandibles moved, viscous, saliva flowing down from them in a torrent of transparent mucus. In a flash of lightning, he was able to see and instantly register every spike, every scratch, every abrasion on the creature's carapace. The handle of Changing Star's sword was still protruding from its body, washed in azure blood. What an ugly bastard! Sonny was being hypocritical. Truth be told, with its black carapace painted with crimson patterns and a mighty body specially designed for mayhem and slaughter, the Scythe Slayer looked striking and incredibly menacing. It was almost majestic, in a terrifying, murderous kind of way. Unable to move, he had to look helplessly as the monster closed the distance between them and loomed over Sonny's broken, bleeding body. Its scythes rose into the air, ready to strike down. Looking right into the monster's burning eyes, Sonny thought, "Go to hell, you overgrown bug." The scythe shot toward his body. In the last moment, something massive and furious rammed into the monster from the side, throwing it away. It was Sonny's carapace scavenger. Not bothering with its own safety anymore, the echo entwined itself with the enemy in a chaotic mess of limbs as they rolled on the ground. Despite the fact that it was smaller and weaker, its crazy assault and complete disregard for its own life were enough to give the bigger monster some pause. The echo lashed out with its pincers, ramming them against the creature's carapace in a crazy whirlwind of blows. For a moment, the howling of the wind was drowned out by the clamor of chitin striking against chitin. The Slayer's carapace mostly held, but a couple of cracks did appear on its black surface. However, it was still superior to the scavenger in every way. Even with one of its scythes pinned awkwardly under its body, the monster was more than able to repel the sudden attack. With an angry screech, it sliced with the other scythe, cutting one of the scavenger's pincer arms clean off. Then it strained its legs and threw the smaller creature away. In the process, the rear leg that was already wounded by Sonny broke off. But the monster didn't pay it any attention. Burning with madness and fury, it untangled its limbs and slowly stood up. Another deafening screech resounded in the howling darkness of the storm, hurting Sonny's ears. Now what? He thought, momentarily lost for ideas. But then something very unexpected happened. As the Slayer moved to finish off the echo, it had to slightly raise and lean its torso back to account for the loss of a rear leg and keep its balance. At that moment, a bolt of lightning landed right in the middle of the small island. With how tall the monster was, the lightning was immediately attracted to the handle of the sword that was still sticking from its body, aimed at the sky at a slight angle. At that moment, Changing Star's longsword suddenly became a lightning rod. Instantly, hundreds of millions of volts of electricity coursed through the Slayer's body. In a blinding flash of light, it was thrown to the ground. Wisps of smoke rose from the cracks in its carapace. In a strange turn of events, arcs of residual electricity danced on the monster's chitin, slowly accumulating on the crimson patterns on it. Under that influence, the crimson pattern changed its color, becoming white and incandescent. Sonny stared at all this in bewilderment. It's glowing. For a second, he hoped that the monster was dead. But no, a single strike of lightning was not enough to kill a creature like that. Just a few moments. After being electrocuted, the Slayer moved, slightly shaking its body. Although it was in a rather bad shape, it was still alive and full of murderous intent. Looking somewhat dazed, the monster gathered its limbs and tried to stand. Up, slowly but surely, it was coming back to its senses. The bone scythes scraped against the rocks, helping it rise. However, before it did, Nephi's was suddenly right in front of it. Grabbing the hilt of the longsword, she grimaced as the heat burned her hands. Then she twisted the blade, making the Slayer's body twitch, and pulled it out, breaking apart a large portion of its lower torso armor. The monster tried to slash at her with a scythe, but Changing Star was quicker. Dashing to the side, she simultaneously lashed out with her sword. The glowing, white-hot blade caught the creature's arm right below the joint and cleaved through it, sending the terrifying bone scythe flying through the air in a rain of azure blood. The Slayer screeched and swatted her away with one of its legs. Nephi's was thrown back and rolled on the rocks, losing her grip on the sword. Her eyes momentarily lost focus. The monster, on the contrary, was back to its sense. It seemed as though the sudden pain of losing a limb had shaken it wide awake. Raising to its full height, it opened its ugly mouth and let out a deafening, enraged shriek. Then it lunged toward Neph with all-consuming hatred burning in its eyes. But it didn't get far. Right as the livid monster was beginning its attack, the battered Ek appeared in its path. Its one remaining pincer shot forward, plunging into the wide gap in the armor created by Changing Star's sword. Twisting its arm, the scavenger pushed it inside the enemy's body, wreaking havoc on its innards. In the end, it even lifted the whole monster in the air a little, its pincer going in almost up to the shoulder. The Slayer lashed out with its scythe, piercing the Echo's chest through. Then it twitched a couple of times and fell still. The scavenger screeched angrily and jerked its pincer, tearing the bigger monster's torso clean off its carapace, proudly giving the eviscerated enemy one last look. It then staggered and collapsed to the ground. Sonny tiredly dismissed the Echo, hoping that it can survive. He wasn't feeling too well. In fact, he was pretty much done for. You have slain an awakened monster, Carapace Centurion. The spell's voice fell uselessly on his deaf ears. It sounded distorted and distant. You have received a memory, Starlight Legion armor. Your shadow grows stronger. I want. Sonny closed his eyes, finally allowing pain and exhaustion to flood his mind. The fog was back, making everything feel like it was happening to someone else. He was tired, and he couldn't breathe. Drowning in blood was not very pleasant. As his conscience began to slip, he heard the sound of someone's hurried steps, and then 2 soft hands gently touched his face. Chapter 53, Immortal Flame Shadow Slave. Somewhat surprised, Sonny struggled to open his eyes. As his vision slowly focused, he saw Neph's pale face looming above him. Her short silver hair was wet, sticking close to her skin. She was standing on her knees beside his broken body, caressing his face. With her hands, in her eyes there was a strange expression. It was as though she was frightened but resigned to something. Her pupils were wide and dark. What? Greeting her teeth, Nephi's moved her hands to his collapsed chest and pressed them lightly against it, causing a pulse of pain to radiate through Sonny's body. Then a soft, radiant brilliance suddenly ignited beneath the skin of her palms, reflecting in her gray eyes like 2 dancing white sparks. Almost immediately, Changing Star's face contorted in a grimace of excruciating agony, and she let out a terrible, muffled scream. Her skin became white as a sheet of paper, and as she bit her lower lip, drops of blood soon rolled to her chin. As the radiance grew in intensity, Nephi's shut her eyes tightly, tears streaming down her tortured, bloodless face. Sonny, on the contrary, felt like he was in heaven. All pain disappeared. From his body, replaced by gentle, all-encompassing warmth, he felt as though he was being cleansed by something pure and sacred, by a white, pristine, purifying flame. Under the influence of the flame, his dying body began to repair itself. His shattered bones were reassembled from the shards, his torn flesh regenerated and became whole again. His collapsed lungs and damaged heart were brought back to life and rejuvenated, instantly turning strong and healthy. Suddenly he could breathe again. As his chest moved, drawing in a new breath, Nephi's flinched away with a harrowing moan. The white radiance beneath her skin dimmed and disappeared, letting the darkness return to its rightful place. Crawling away a few steps, Changing Star stopped, standing on her knees, and hands, and violently vomited. Her whole body was shivering, uncontrollably, as though on the verge of a seizure. As the shivers died down, she slowly lowered herself to the ground and lay there motionlessly, catching the raindrops with her mouth. Sonny, meanwhile, raised his hands and carefully explored his body. To his surprise, nothing really hurt. It was as though he was never wounded. In the first place, let alone almost died. With the help of Nephi's and her mysterious aspect ability, he was completely healed. It was a miracle. By the time the storm was over, it was already deep into the night. Sonny, Nephi's and Cassie huddled together for warmth and slept as though they were dead, too tired to make someone keep watch. If anything were to happen, the shadow would probably alarm them in advance. If not, so be it. They were just too exhausted to care. Luckily, the rest of the night went without incidents. In the morning, no one was in a hurry to make any plans or suggest leaving the cliffs. They just gathered some meat from the dead Carapace Centurion, and the scavengers collected the 2 soul shards and moved to the opposite side of the small island, afraid that the remains would attract some creatures' attention. As it turned out, they were right. Not long after the group left the place of the battle, a dark spot appeared in the sky. Soon it became larger and approached the cliffs, landing near the corpse of the Centurion in a whirlwind. Sonny had never seen anything like it. The creature was massive in size, easily weighing twice as much as the Carapace monster. Its body was white, as a corpse, and muscular, like that of a lion. It had 2 mighty paws in the back and 6 in the front, protruding messily out of its wide chest. Each ended with long, sharp talons. The neck of the flying monstrosity was covered in long black feathers, as well as its enormous wings. Its head resembled that of a raven, with large, round eyes and a terrifying black beak. While they hid behind rocks, the creature feasted on the dead Centurion, easily breaking its carapace apart with its talons and beak. Then, satisfied, it grabbed a few scavenger carcasses with its paws and rose back into the air, creating a small hurricane with each flap of its black wings. The creature left the cliffs and flew back the way it came. It was moving west, following the black dot as it disappeared into the distance. Sonny sighed. "Neph, what do you think that thing is?" Nephi's was also looking at the sky. After a few seconds, she lowered her gaze. "I have no idea." Sonny simply nodded and went about his business. He still had to perform his 1,000 strikes. After making a fire, they roasted the Centurion's meat and had a delicious, hefty breakfast. Then, stuffed, the 3 of them lied down and lazily rested. After fighting against 2 scavengers at once, running away and barely surviving the sudden flood, climbing tall cliffs in the middle of a storm, and battling an awakened monster, all done in a single day, they deserved some time off. Plus, Sonny needed to sort himself out. Truth be told, he was feeling a bit strange. The reason for this was not his traumatic near-death experience, although it had a lot to do with it. The thing was that, after the unexpected epiphany he had while trying to fight against the deathly mind fog, Sonny felt as though he had been changed, because the clarity he gained never went away. It was still here at the center of his being. He felt as though his very way of thinking and perceiving the world was now completely different. It was stark, streamlined, and dauntless. Sonny felt that he had become calmer. He was now able to think much faster and act without hesitation. Many things that previously seemed obscure and frightening suddenly became predictable, and thus surmountable. It was as though he had discovered an underlying order to the world that wasn't there before. That inner understanding gave him an advantage that was hard to explain with words. In a sense, this change was even more profound than the transformation of his body at the end of the first nightmare. He felt that he had made a big leap in his combat ability and overall power, even though it wasn't tied to the number of consumed shadow fragments or unlocked aspect abilities. Looking at the sky, Sonny wondered if this was how Nephi's always felt. Probably. Mastery of the body, mastery of the mind, right. He was still far away from being a master, but it felt as though he was on the right track. Some time later, Sunny approached the western edge of the cliffs. Nephi's was sitting there, her feet dangling over the edge. She was looking. West lost in her thoughts. He sat down beside the silver-haired girl and followed her gaze, trying to guess what she was thinking about. Just like always, he failed. Changing Star was hard to understand. Sunny shifted, feeling incredibly embarrassed. Finally, he gathered his courage and said, "You saved my life twice yesterday." Nephi's glanced at him and turned away again. "I did." He hesitated, trying to find the correct words. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything and simply said, "Thank you." This time she looked at him a bit longer. Her face was calm and indifferent. "There's no need to thank me. Without you and your shadow, we would have drowned before reaching the cliffs, or been torn apart by a large group of scavengers after stumbling on them in the labyrinth." After that uncharacteristically long sentence, she fell silent and added after a while, "We're allies." Sunny nodded, knowing that she was right. Still, Nephi's went above and beyond to keep him alive. Even if he had also done his part, not everyone would have gone to such lengths to return the favor. However, he didn't say anything about it, mostly because he could already imagine her answer. Staring right at him, she would stay quiet for some time and then say something like, "I just wanted to," or "It is what it is," in a flat tone. And then there would be an awkward silence. With a subtle smile, Sunny looked away. A minute or two later, he said, "It's you flaw, isn't it? The pain you feel every time you use your ability." Nephi's was silent for a while before answering. Then she simply said, "Yes." Sunny looked at her. Changing Star's profile was calm and distant. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. "What does it feel like?" She was staring into the distance. "Like burning alive." He sighed, trying to imagine what kind of suffering someone being burned alive would have to endure. As always, the spell was vile and cruel. "I'm sorry," he said quietly after some time. Nephi shrugged, not turning her head. "It's just pain." Sunny looked away, trying to hide his expression. Just pain. These might have been the saddest words he had ever heard. Chapter 54. Spoils of War. For a long while, they just sat quietly together. Nephi's was looking at the horizon, thinking about something only she knew about. Sunny's mind was strangely empty. From time to time, he would cast a glance inside his soul sea, observing the recuperating echo. The scavenger managed to survive its fight against the carapace centurion, even if it was just barely. Now enveloped in a cocoon of light, it was flowing in the calming darkness of Sunny's soul and slowly regenerating. If an echo managed to retreat into the sea of soul alive, it would eventually recover from any wounds. The holes on the scavenger's carapace were already beginning to close. Its lost pincer arm, however, was not growing back any time soon. Sunny sighed and summoned the runes. He decided to go over the spoils of the harrowing battle. Shadow fragments, 28/1000. Since it was his echo that delivered the final blow, the kill was considered to be his. Thus he received 4 shadow fragments, 2 for each of the Centurion's awakened cores. The shards of the cores themselves went to Nephi's as per their agreement. She decided to consume one herself and give the other one to Cassie. The reward was sizable but seemed disproportionate to the amount of trouble they had gone through to get rid of the terrifying monster. Ultimately, dormant humans like them were really not supposed to battle awakened nightmare creatures. No way, really, he thought to himself, full of sarcasm. It was just their bad luck that there was not a single Dormantrank creature in this whole damned region of the dream realm. Sunny remembered his lofty plans of hunting weak monsters while safely protected from all their attacks by his Tier 5 awakened armor and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Who knew that the puppeteer's shroud would turn out to be merely a minimum requirement for survival, as opposed to a huge, odds-defying advantage. Still, that armor had already saved his life twice, so it was doing its job. Speaking of armor, he lowered his gaze. Memory, Starlight Legion armor. Memory rank awakened. Memory type armor. Memory description, born in the all-consuming darkness, 7 valiant heroes made an oath to return light to the cursed land. Time has erased their names and their faces, but the memory of the defiant oath still remains. Teacher Julius would have been ecstatic to be reading this stuff. The old man used to be an avid explorer and student of the dream realms. History before becoming a professor in the Awakened Academy and settling down in one of the most prosperous human citadels. He was still one of the leading researchers in that field, often irritating hunting expeditions with requests to explore this or that ruin. Sadly, Sonny had no idea when they would meet again. He cleared his throat and looked at Nephi's. "Anyway, I have a present for you." She turned her head and looked at him with a bit of confusion. "A present." Sonny smiled. "Yeah, I forgot to tell you that I received a memory after we finished off the Centurion. Guess what type it is?" He glanced at her expectantly, however, Changing Star did not guess. In fact, her expression did not even show a hint of curiosity. After an awkward pause, Sonny had to look away. It's an armor. So give me your hand." Physical contact was required to transfer a memory. Otherwise, he would have preferred to avoid it for as long as possible. There had already been too much contact between them for his mental composure. In retrospect, being invaded by the healing flame was a strangely intimate experience, not to mention the memory of her soft touch. Not that he had been in any condition to think about such things back then. Staring right at him, Nephi slowly held out a hand. Sonny hurriedly grasped it in his own, wishing to be done with this part of the process as soon as possible. Her skin was cool and soft. Trying not to get distracted, he willed the Starlight Legion armor to be expelled from his soul sea. One of the spheres of light disappeared from the Shadow Core's orbit. Immediately, he felt something akin to a spark of electricity moving through his body and into Changing Stars. She blinked and retracted her hand. Then Nephi stood up, walked a few steps away from the edge of the cliff, and summoned the memory. Spinning sparks of light appeared around her. A moment later, they covered her porcelain body and turned into a black, skin-tight bodysuit made out of an unknown, durable material. It looked quite similar to the rubbery seaweed that permeated the area. Then, intricate pieces of pristine white plate armor materialized over the black bodysuit. First the greaves and vambraces, then articulated pauldrons, and rerebraces, then cuisses and sabatons. Finally, a breastplate engraved, with 7 shining stars, appeared to protect Neph's torso, short enough to pose no hindrance to her mobility. It was followed by a helmet with a white plume. The engraving of the 7 stars was identical to those carved into the giant knight statue's cuirass. The armor looked light and elegant. It was simultaneously functional and flattering, both providing high levels of protection and accentuating the graceful lines of Changing Star's body. A stark contrast of black and white, made for quite a striking sight. Nephi's dismissed the helmet, letting her silver hair move in the wind. Then, she summoned her sword and performed a few tentative pirouettes, testing out the weight and flexibility of the armor. Seemingly satisfied, she then let the sword disappear into the air. Sonny observed all this in silence. When Neph was finally done, he asked, "Well, how is it?" She turned to him. Soon, a wide smile appeared on her face. Beaming with delight, Nephi's hesitated and finally said with a bit of embarrassment, "Much better." Sonny heaved a sigh of relief. At least now all 3 of them were properly clothed. That was good, really good. Not only because Changing Star's combat effectiveness would dramatically increase due to the acquisition of a reliable armor, but also because now he wouldn't have to be distracted every time he saw her. Chapter 55. Lucky People Shadow Slave. When they returned to the makeshift camp, the first thing that Nephi's did was come up to Cassie. "Hey Cass, guess what?" The blind girl turned to her and smiled. "You've finally received an armor-type memory." Simultaneously, Nephi said, "I found something decent to wear." Then she fell silent and stared at her smiling friend. Cassie laughed. "The sound of your footsteps changed." Changing Star blinked. "Ah, I see. Well, it's from the Carapace Centurion." While she was describing the armor to Kasha and letting her touch the mysterious white metal it was forged out of, Sonny relaxed and rested by the fire. Sometime later, Nephi's was busy preparing dinner. Sonny was once again lying lazily on the stones and staring into the sky. The sky, like always, was gray and unfriendly. With all 3 of them equipped with decent armor, they were finally starting to resemble a real awakened cohort. In fact, Sonny thought that their group was rather eye-catching even by awakened standards. In her light tunic and sea-wave cloak, beautiful and delicate Cassie looked like a princess. Lithe and poised, Nephi's was like a noble knight tasked with protecting her. Sonny, however, if he was generous to himself, he would say that he looked like a young squire, but truthfully, he resembled a page boy a lot more at best. If a random stranger were to see the 3 of them, that stranger would most likely assume that Sonny was either a lowly servant or a feeble ruffian that had been captured by the noble lady's guard. Well, that'll just add to their surprise when I stab them in the back. Wait, why would he stab a random stranger? Ah, who cares? I'm sure there'll be a reason. At that moment, Cassie sat down by his side. Sonny turned his head. Looking at the blind girl with a bit of surprise, she bit her lip. Nephi's told me that you almost died yesterday. Oh, so that's what this is about. He shrugged, yeah. Then with a silent sigh, Sonny added, but don't worry about it too much. It's not my first brush with death. Although it was, as far as he knew, the closest. The memory still sent. Shivers running down his spine. Cassie was silent for a while, then she quietly said, I'm sorry. Sonny raised his eyebrows. Sorry, what are you sorry for? The blind girl lowered her eyes. For being so useless. Sonny frowned and looked away. A second or two later, he said in his usual, careless tone, you're not useless. Cassie softly chuckled. Aren't I? If I want to walk, I need to be leashed to you or Neff if I want to. Eat, I need to wait for one of you to feed me. That's my life now. I can't do even the simplest of things without your help, let alone be of use to either. Of you in return. Slowly, her voice turned raw with emotion. This was the first time Sonny had seen her mask of resolve slip a little, revealing the desperate, angry, frightened face beneath. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, Hey, have I ever told you about my first nightmare? The blind girl shook her head. Sonny half closed his eyes. My first nightmare was as bad as it gets. To tell you the truth, the situation was pretty hopeless. I was a slave destined to die of cold or mistreatment, chained, bleeding, defenseless. What's worse, my aspect turned out to be completely useless. I mean literally. If I remember correctly, the phrase the spell chosen to describe it was a useless wretch, with no skills or abilities worth a mention. Cassie turned her head slightly, visibly drawn in by his words. Then, how did you survive? Did things change for the better? Sonny smiled. Gods know, in fact, they quickly turned worse, much, much worse, but what? Would you know? In a strange twist of fate, my useless aspect turned out to be the only thing that could guide me through that mess alive. In that regard, I was incredibly lucky. He shifted a little and glanced at the delicate girl, noticing a thoughtful frown on her face. But here is a thing about luck. People usually speak about it as though luck is something that just happens to you. It's not. Luck is 50% circumstance and 50% your own ability to grasp it. Luck is something you have to make happen yourself. I fought with everything I had to survive. That's one of the two reasons I'm still here. Saying that, Sonny remembered the cold, dark mountain and shivered. Then, pushing the chilling memories away, he continued. The second reason is the spell itself. I won't go as far as to call it reasonable, but it is fair in its own perverted way. The spell takes with one hand and gives with the other. It was like this with my first nightmare. And it is the same with you. Cassie's frown deepened. Sonny chose his next words very carefully. Eventually, he said, Your flaw is the most debilitating one I have ever seen or heard of. You are right. Without help from someone like Neff, it would have been a certain death sentence. And people like her, well, I'm not even sure that someone else like that exists, but the blind girl gritted her teeth. But what? Sonny looked at her with a serious expression. But that also means that the other side of the flaw, your power, is equally as extraordinary. You just haven't found the way to grasp it yet. When you do, believe me, you'll remember this conversation and feel very embarrassed about how naive and foolish you were. Cassie's expression changed to one of doubt and confusion. Do you really think so? She whispered. There was a hint of desperate desire in her voice. However, the question itself almost made him laugh for an obvious reason. Trust me, I'm the most honest person in the world. Two worlds, in fact. Sonny would actually love nothing more than to be less honest, but sadly he was physically incapable of doing so. Of course, she didn't have to. Know that? Cassie was silent for a long time, lost in thought. It looked as though she was in the throes of some inner struggle. Sonny almost assumed that their conversation was over, but then she suddenly said in a low, raspy voice, I had more visions than I told you guys about. Chapter 56. The heaviest thing in the world. He blinked, staring at the blind girl with surprise and a bit of apprehension. Her sudden statement really threw him off. Why would she keep something like this secret, and why tell him now? Confused, he asked carefully, More visions? Why haven't you told us? A fleeting, tired smile appeared on Cassie's face. She lowered her head and remained silent for a while. Then, closing her eyes, she said, You probably don't know. How could you know? But knowledge. Knowledge can be really heavy. It can be as heavy as the heaviest thing in the world. Then a sad smile appeared on her face. I am afraid that by telling you, I will actually cause the things I saw to come true. Sunny tensed up, alarmed by the implication behind her words. If she was afraid of the visions coming true, then their content must have been pretty bad, and if it was really bad, if something terrible was destined to befall them, Sunny had to know about it in advance. That way, he would be able to make preparations and deal with whatever happens. As long as he was prepared, many things would become much less dire. However, what if his preparations would become the very reason for that terrible thing to happen, making Cassie's vision self-fulfilling prophecy? This was the danger of knowing the future. Damn it, my head hurts, I hate this crap. Sunny struggled for a long time, trying to decide if he should pressure Cassie to reveal her visions. Either outcome was going to leave him uneasy, so he was really not sure what to do. In the end, unable to make a decision, Sunny simply remained silent. Cassie also didn't say anything. After some time had passed, she finally spoke. Can you just promise me one thing?" It seemed as though this was her attempt to find a compromise between revealing everything and doing nothing. Sunny frowned. "That depends on what it is." The blind girl hesitated before speaking. "Can you promise that you'll take care of Neff, no matter what?" He delayed answering for as long as the growing pain allowed him. When it became almost unbearable, Sunny reluctantly said, I can't. I can barely take care of myself." He also didn't trust Nephi's enough to make a promise like that. He had nothing against Changing Star and even liked her quite a bit, but they didn't really know each other. Their alliance was one of necessity, not choice. Who knew what would happen once their need for each other was no longer there? No matter what was too steep of a requirement. Of course, he could have misled Cassie by answering yes. After all, the question was whether or not he could make a promise, not whether or not he would follow through with it. But at that moment, Sunny was strangely reluctant to deceive the blind girl. Maybe that whole honesty thing was slowly growing on him. Cassie sighed and turned away. Suddenly, it felt like something imperceptible about her changed. I see. Yeah, that's fair. With that, she summoned her staff and walked away, leaving Sunny in a somber and uneasy mood, just like he had expected. No matter how much he tried to relax after that, his thoughts kept wandering. Eventually, Sunny found himself trying to find connections between various pieces of information about the Starless Void, or the Forgotten Shore, as it was called in the Azure Blade's description. If nothing else, it could distract him from thinking about the latter part of their conversation with Cassie. Also, for some reason, the need to understand their environment suddenly seemed much more vital. His sword, the Starlight Legion armor, the carapace monsters, and the giant headless statue seemed to be connected in some way, but he couldn't quite understand how. Was the statue a monument to one of the 7 founders of the Starlight Legion? The line of runes describing the armor said that their names and faces were lost to time. The statue's missing head would certainly fit that description. The scavenger's echo suggested that the carapace monsters were cursed soldiers of the Fallen Legion. Was that Fallen Legion the Starlight Legion? The fact that he had received the Starlight armor after slaying a carapace Centurion was almost a certain confirmation of that theory. If so, why were they cursed, Starless Void, Starlight Legion? What did all of it mean? The 7 heroes were described as being born in the all-consuming darkness. Their oath was to return light to the cursed land. What light did they seek? Starlight? And what was the nature of the all-consuming darkness? Was it the manifestation of the curse that befell their land? And if so, was it the same curse that eventually turned soldiers of the Starlight Legion into carapace monsters? If the curse was still around, was Sunny going to wake up one day with patches of chitin growing over his skin? What a creepy thought. The 7 heroes were forgotten, but the memory of their oath, apparently, still remained. On this forgotten shore, only Stell remembers. That was the Azure Blade's description. Was there a hidden meaning behind these words? Were the memories received on the forgotten shore hiding a secret? Inwardly, Sunny groaned. So many questions and not a single answer. And then there was the main mystery, Cassie's vision, the one she chose to reveal to them. She dreamt of a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Once the seals were broken, the darkness escaped. She also saw a crimson spire with 7 severed heads guarding 7 locks. Were these locks connected to the seals? And was the giant knight's missing head one of the 7 guarding them? Or was he completely wrong about everything, leaping to conclusions and forcing connections where none existed? Sunny sighed, knowing that his curiosity would not be quenched any time soon. He had too little information to make a proper theory. If so, there was No point in torturing himself right now. Maybe things would become clearer in the future. The word future made him frown. Chapter 57. Use of weapons. In the evening, Sonny continued to practice with the sword under Neff's watchful eye. With his new insight, every movement felt different from before. After the 1,000 strikes were finished, he sat down to rest and studied the azure blade, tempted to continue obsessing over the abundant mysteries of the forgotten shore. After a while, Sonny asked, "Do you think I'm well suited to use a sword? Should I consider switching weapons in the future?" Nephi shrugged. "That depends on your goals. However, the sword is considered to be the king of weapons for a reason." Sonny smiled. "And why is that?" She tilted her head and deliberated for a few seconds. Then she asked, "Do you know how natural selection works?" He raised an eyebrow. "Survival of the fittest. The strongest species survives." Changing Star glanced at him. "Somewhat correct, but actually it's not the strongest species that survive. It's the most adaptable. Otherwise, lions and tigers and bears would have been the ones ruling the world instead of humans." Sonny knew about lions and bears from archival footage, but he had no idea what a tiger was. Probably another extinct predator. Meanwhile, Neff continued, not at all like her usual taciturn self. She seemed to be much more eloquent when talking about subjects she was confident in. The same logic can be applied to combat. A sword is not the most effective tool in every situation. A spear is more useful against enemies with long reach. A warhammer is much better against armor. A mace is easier to maintain. However, swords are the most versatile. She cast a gaze at the azure blade. A sword can pierce, it can cut, it can bash. It can be used effectively at a variety of ranges. It is swift and maneuverable. Every part of the sword, from tip to pommel, can be used to attack. While wielding a sword, you won't be the best at everything, but you'll be the most adaptable. Nephi's turned to him. "Do you understand?" Sonny thought for a bit before answering. "I think I do." She gave him a nod and looked away. "But in the end, you must remember one thing. It doesn't matter that much. What's in your hands? A sword, a spear, a club, that's just tools. You are the weapons." He sighed and dismissed the azure blade. As always, changing stars. Lesson gave him a lot to think about. "You are the weapon." He repeated it in his mind, feeling as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Together they watched the sun set in comfortable silence. As the night approached, the sea was coming back, flooding the crimson labyrinth like a rush of darkness. Far below them, scavengers were scurrying to find a hiding place. A few of them were climbing the cliffs, hoping to spend the night on the small island. Sonny's shadow was keeping an eye on them. "We're going to have guests soon," he said, disheartened at the thought that their short respite was about to end. Nephi sighed. "That's all right. With the higher ground advantage, dealing with them won't be too hard." Sonny nodded and looked at the disappearing sun. Suddenly, his mood turned solemn. Doubt raised its ugly head, plunging his mind into the gloomy embrace of anxiety. Staring into the distance, Sonny hesitated and asked, "Do you think we'll be able to reach that castle?" She glanced at him with no particular expression on her face. "Yes." He turned to her and forced a smile. "Why are you so sure?" In the blood-red blaze of the sunset, Changing Star's calm eyes seemed to burn with heavenly fire. Looking west, she summoned her sword and answered, "If that is our will, who dares to stop us?" Dealing with the climbing scavengers, indeed, turned out to be comparatively easy. Sonny and Nephi's just had to ambush and push the bulky creatures off the cliff before they could find stable purchase. He received 4 shadow fragments practically for free, increasing the overall number to 32. Sadly, the soul shards couldn't be retrieved. They spent another day on the cliffs, resting and training. Sonny practiced with the sword while his shadow explored the nearby paths of the labyrinth. With the echo still recovering, their group was not in its optimal condition. That's why there was no point in hastily abandoning their current camp. However, very soon they were going to resume the journey west, moving from one height to another in hopes of reaching the mysterious human citadel. This time they were not going to travel without sufficient preparations, knowing that a sudden storm can come at any moment, covering the world. With darkness and summoning the sea back before sunset, the 3 sleepers decided to thoroughly scout a route before committing to moving there. Camp to the next landmark. Nephi spent the day meditating. Her eyes were closed. From time to time, it seemed as though a soft white glow was radiating from behind her eyelids. However, when Sonny looked closely, it was always gone, making him think that he was just imagining things. He suspected that Changing Star was training herself to endure the pain of her flaw. If so, he wished her luck. Cassie behaved like her usual self, being cheerful and friendly. It was as though their strange conversation had never happened. However, Sonny could feel that something about her was different. He couldn't quite put a finger on what exactly had changed about the blind girl, but she seemed to possess more resolve. It wasn't a bad thing. They spent some time chatting and remembering their time in the academy. Sonny told her about his lessons with teacher Julius and various things he had learned from the old man. Her reaction to the idea of studying dead languages of the dream realm was exactly the same as Sonny's initial protest and bewilderment. Soon the night was upon them again. This time no scavenger tried to climb the cliffs so Sonny and Nephi's could rest easy. However, they still slept in turns, keeping watch over the camp in case something unexpected happens. In the morning, they ate the last of the Centaurians' meat and prepared to climb down into the labyrinth. It was time to continue their journey. Chapter 58, Survival of the Fittest. Days later, Sonny was sitting on top of a dead scavenger, calmly cleaning the azure blood off his face. Your shadow grows stronger. His sword was still stuck between the plates of chitin armor, trembling slightly as the beast's body convulsed before falling still. Somewhere behind him, the sound of breaking carapaces announced that Nephi's was already digging out soul shards from the corpses of the creatures they had slain. After dozens of such battles, the two of them were nothing if not efficient. Glancing back, he evaluated the scene of carnage. The path between two crimson walls was littered with corpses. Initially, they were simply planning to lure the carapace Centaurian that had been tracking them for the past few days into this narrow passage to turn its size against the monster. However, things quickly took a turn. Attracted by the noise of the battle, both the scavengers and the weird centipede creatures that were waging war against the Carapace Legion in this part of the labyrinth showed up to join the fight. In the ensuing mayhem, Sonny and Nephi's used the animosity between the two tribes of monsters to their advantage and ended up as the only victors. Not far from him, the Echo was mutilating the corpse of the Centaurian. Its lost arm had long grown back. Now the scavenger was tearing pieces of monster meat with its new pincer and vindictively devouring them. Technically, an Echo wasn't supposed to experience hunger. This one, however, had seemingly acquired a hatred for Carapace Centaurians after their encounter with the massive Scythe Slayer on that fateful stormy night. It had already been 2 weeks since they left the cliffs. In that time, many things had changed while many remained the same. Moving from one high point to another, they steadily traveled west. With Cassie riding atop the Echo, the speed of the group was dramatically enhanced. Still, they took care to explore paths to their next stop before committing to a day-long journey. This way, the risk of being caught in another storm was minimized, as they could always either reach the next landmark in time or return to the previous one. Their approach to traveling through the labyrinth had also changed. In the past, Nephi's and Sonny tried to avoid the scavengers, resorting to fighting them only if there was no other choice. However, the battle with the Centaurian opened their eyes to the fact that they desperately needed to become stronger and do it fast. That's why they began to actively hunt the carapace beasts, taking out any creatures that were either completely isolated or moving in groups of no more than 3. The idea of 2 sleepers consciously seeking out nightmare creatures of the awakened rank was pretty ridiculous, but somehow they made it work. Just as Nephi's had said, both of them were abnormal. Clad in the Starlight Legion armor, Changing Star, who had always been an extremely formidable fighter, was now able to showcase the full extent of her combat ability. Simply put, she was a menace. It seemed as though her silver sword had a mind of its own. Whenever the tall figure in white armor appeared, rivers of azure blood were sure to flow. What's more, Neph's powers grew with each soul shard she consumed. Every increase was barely noticeable, but with dozens of them added up. Together, the difference was apparent. She was slowly approaching the line between the peak of human physical form and the threshold of superhuman prowess. The same could be said about Sonny, although in his case it was predicated on the timely use of the shadow. His own body had become considerably stronger due to the rigors of the dream realm, but it was still far away from reaching its peak potential. While Nephi's was growing more powerful through the consumption of soul shards, he was quickly collecting shadow fragments. Of course, he wasn't able to get every kill, so their amount was less than that of the shards. But he also didn't have to share them with Cassie, which Changing Star was continuously doing. As the result, the rate of their progress was more or less the same. However, the slow accumulation of power was not the only factor that influenced the rapid growth of their combat effectiveness. Sunny's skill level and battle sense were also improving by leaps and bounds. Under the tutelage of sword goddess Nephis herself, he was quickly learning the ins and outs of wielding the blade. Then he was forced to apply these lessons to practice, participating in bloody battles each day with his life on the line. This brutal, merciless reality was, for better or worse, the best training grounds for a true fighter. There was no room for mistakes, only progress, because a single mistake would most likely become his last. One real fight was worth 1,000 hours of training. With experience, Sunny was able to gain knowledge. With clarity, he was able to turn this knowledge into a seed of understanding. But even that wasn't the biggest contributor to the dramatic increase in the group's overall might. The main culprit was, to his endless surprise, teamwork. After fighting side by side for so long, Sunny and Nephis had developed a tacit, intuitive understanding. Without the need for words and signals, they were able to act in unison with each other, perfectly coordinating their attacks and actions to better control the battlefield and destroy their opponents. The importance of this unity was hard to overestimate. With proper cooperation, it was as though their numbers doubled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, at least as long as they chose their battles carefully. It was nothing short of jolly. With all this added up together, their group had turned from a trio of lost kids into a cohort of well-equipped, experienced, and battle-hardened survivors. Even Cassie was becoming stronger. Apart from the boost she had received from absorbing the soul shards, the blind girl was also slowly learning to live and function with her disability. After all, it was less than 2 months since she lost her sight. Cassie was still adapting to her condition, and she was doing an incredible job. Considering the circumstances, she was still unable to help them fight against the monsters, but the burden of taking care of her was becoming less and less heavy. Sunny had also grown accustomed to it, even finding the time spent watching over the blind girl somewhat calming. The goal of reaching the human castle did not seem as impossible as it had before, and now he felt as though they were getting closer and closer. Chapter 59, Shadow of the Crimson Spire. Jumping off the dead scavenger, Sunny retrieved his sword and whistled, letting Cassie know that it was safe to come out. Soon she crawled out of a small opening in the coral wall and carefully put her feet on the ground. Leaning on her staff, the blind girl stood up and slightly turned her head. Listening to the light sound of his footsteps, Sunny approached Cassie and took her hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. Then, carefully avoiding puddles of blood, he guided the blind girl to the echo. They talked on the way. Did those centipedes show up? During their journey through the labyrinth, they discovered that the scavengers were not the only creatures populating it. Different types of monsters lived in the Crimson Forest, hiding inside the reefs during the night, and coming out to hunt once the sun was up. There were sentient colonies of carnivorous worms that attacked from beneath the black mud, flesh-eating flowers that strangled their prey with blood-sucking vines, and weird transparent tentacles that they had once seen, dragging a desperately resisting scavenger into a dark, cavernous crevice. They still didn't know what type of creature had been hiding in the crevice. Sunny hoped that they would never find out. In short, the labyrinth was home to all kinds of horrors, every one of them, at least of the awakened rank. They were all carrion eaters, living off the remains left behind by the monsters of the Dark Sea. Given the opportunity, they were also more than willing to devour each other, not to mention the 3 juicy humans. Luckily, the Carapace Legion turned out to be extremely territorial and seemed to have the upper hand in this region of the Crimson Reef, while their armor, size, and physical strength made the scavengers formidable. Opponents, dealing mostly with one type of creature, was infinitely better than constantly facing unknown danger. The centipede monsters were the latest enemy of the Carapace Legion they had met. Some of these critters were more than 3 meters long, with glistening red chitin and hundreds of tiny, scurrying legs. They were abhorrently fast and agile, being able to move through mud, climb the coral walls, and even drop on the unsuspecting victims from above with incredible speed. What's worse, their bodies were able to secrete a corrosive black oil that melted through the strongest armor in seconds. The only redeeming quality of the centipede monsters was that their chitin shells weren't very tough and could be easily pierced by a sword. Sunny answered without turning back. Yeah, 6 of them, and a few scavengers, too. We let them fight each other. And then finished off the survivors. Cassie gulped. Were you hurt? Nothing our armor couldn't handle. What about the Centurion? He glanced at the half-devoured carcass and smiled. It's not going to bother us again. This was the second awakened monster they had slain after entering the Dream Realm. Compared to the first encounter, this battle went much smoother. No one died, no one was seriously injured. The Echo even kept both of its pincers. How many soul shards did we get? Sunny counted. Should be 11. Now it was Cassie's turn to smile. That's our biggest haul so far by a lot. He nodded. Yeah. However, they had once again failed to receive a memory. Sunny wasn't sure if his bad luck was to blame, but neither he nor Nephi's had been able to acquire a single one for the past 2 weeks. It was almost as though they Spell had decided that they had already gotten enough. There can never be enough. He sighed. One of the games he and Cassie liked to play during camp was to discuss what they would buy after coming back to the real world and becoming rich. However, he had to collect a few memories to auction off first. Otherwise, where would the money come from? Consumed by greed and avarice, Sunny approached the Echo and looked up at it with disapproval. Hey, you. Stop chewing. The scavenger obediently froze, a piece of meat still hanging from its mouth spit it out. Shaking his head, Sunny helped Cassie climb to her seat and handed her the reins. This weirdo actually gobbled up almost half of the Centurion. What's up? With that, of all the Echoes in the world, why did I have to get stuck with a defective one? His shadow solemnly nodded, expressing that it completely understood his sentiment. Sunny squinted at it. What a rare show of solidarity, the shadow. Didn't have any Echoes, though. What defective individual was it stuck with? Cheeky bastard. Cassie laughed. Don't badmouth my steed, he is a great Echo. I like him very much. It's a he now, huh? Sunny shook his head again and got to stripping the remaining meat off the Centurion's carcass. Then he placed the meat into the seaweed saddlebags. Attached to the scavenger, he had made these bags himself to increase the group's carrying capacity. After all, the scavenger was supposed to be extremely strong. Not using it to their advantage would have been an oversight. After that, Sunny sighed and got to the least pleasant task, harvesting the oil sacs from the centipede monster's corpses. Each had 2 of them, connected to a special gland. The whole process was more disgusting than dangerous, since the corrosive effect was only achieved after the liquids from the 2 sacs were mixed. They had not come up with a way to utilize the centipede oil yet, but Nephi's insisted on collecting as much of it as possible. She was sure that it was going to be of use one day. At the very least, the oil was highly flammable. Speaking of Nephi's, by the time Sunny was done collecting the sacks, she had already gathered all the soul shards and was standing in front of the Echo. He showed her his trophies and carefully placed them in a separate saddlebag. All done. She nodded. Sunny looked at the sky, trying to determine the time. The sun was right. Above them, high in the gray sky, there was still plenty of daytime left. What do you think? We're right in between the flat hill and the bone ridge. Should we return or try to reach the ridge today? The ground level of the labyrinth was not uniform. Some parts of it were situated higher than the others. Currently, they were in one such area. Dark Sea was much more shallow here, which meant that there were more natural features that remained above water during the night. That made for shorter distance between them. Nephi's thought for a bit, then said, let's push to the Bone Ridge. They had already scouted most of the way to it yesterday, so there wasn't much danger of getting lost in the labyrinth and not making it on time. With the Carapace Centurion dead, the unpredictable element that had been making their lives harder for these past few days was also gone. Considering this, changing Star's decision seemed proper. Sunny nodded. Okay. With that, he sent his shadow forward. Sometime later, they were approaching the Bone Ridge. The sun was preparing to set, but there was still enough time to get to safety. Sunny, however, felt alarmed and uncomfortable. This feeling began to pursue him soon after they had left the cliffs. It always appeared close to the evening and persisted until the last minutes of the sunset, then disappeared, leaving him puzzled and uneasy. The further west they traveled, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though something was not quite right with the world during that time, but no matter how hard Sunny tried to understand what that wrongness was, he couldn't. In the end, he decided to share his uneasiness with the group. After listening to him, the girls were surprised. It seemed that they did not notice anything Strange, even Cassie, whose affinity to revelations provided her with an incredible intuition, didn't experience the strange feeling. However, she did suggest a theory. Since Sonny was the only one susceptible to the feeling, it was logical to assume that there was something unique about him that made it possible. And the only difference he had from the girls in terms of perception was his shadow sense, which meant that the source of the wrongness most likely had something to do with the behavior of shadows. Guided by her advice, Sonny was finally able to understand the reason for his discomfort. As it turns out, Cassie was right in the hours closest to sunset when the sun was hanging low in the western skies. A vast shadow moved through the labyrinth, affecting his senses and making his skin crawl. The shadow was too distant and colossal to be seen, but he could still feel its presence. When he told Cassie about the immense shadow, she nodded as though it explained everything. Then she said, "That is the shadow of the Crimson Spire." Chapter 60, Bone Ridge Shadow Slave. Back then, it took him a couple of seconds to realize what she was talking about. The spire from your vision, the one with 7 seals. Cassie nodded, "Yes. In my dream, it seemed to be as tall as a mountain. I could even see it from the walls of the human castle, looming in the distance like a crimson spear piercing the skies. When the sun sets, the spire's vast shadow falls over the castle and stretches east as far as you can see." She was silent for a moment, then added, "The feeling I got when looking at the Crimson Spire was very similar to what you had described, only much more intense." Sonny frowned, trying to remember the exact words Cassie had used to describe her vision. 7 severed heads guarding 7 seals, a dying angel being devoured by hungry shadows, feeling of extreme terror and loss. What was the deal with that spire exactly? Is it crimson because it's made out of the same stuff as the labyrinth? The crimson coral surrounding them was not, in fact, coral. It's just what they called it based on some resemblance, for the sake of simplicity. The actual nature of the strange material remained a mystery. Cassie hesitated. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the labyrinth is made from the same stuff as the spire. In other words, the Crimson Spire might have been the source of all this madness. Still, it was just a theory. There was too little information to confirm it. However, Sonny did feel that the spire was, in one way or another, at the center of all things that they had encountered. He just hoped that it wouldn't be their final destination. Knowing the reason behind his restlessness, Sonny was able to endure it much better. He even found a hidden benefit to this situation. As long as he sensed the shadow of the Crimson Spire, he could pinpoint the direction to the human castle, since it was situated somewhere between their locate and the source of the shadow. In a sense, the Crimson Spire had become his inner compass. "Get ready." Neff's voice took Sonny out of his reverie, shaking off the distracting thoughts. He focused on the task at hand. They were getting close to the Bone Ridge. This name came to their minds as soon as they had first laid their eyes on this towering landmark. It was visible from quite a distance, sharply contrasted against the crimson coral and the gray sky in all its ivory splendor. The Bone Ridge was, in fact, made of bone. The skeletal remains of a colossal sea monster lay on an enormous mound of chaotically growing coral, with its arching spine protruding especially high above the ground. It was impossible to say what the terrifying creature had looked like while it was still alive, but one thing was certain: it was gargantuan even by the standards of the Dark Sea. This wasn't the first giant skeleton they saw during their journey. In fact, the labyrinth was littered with remains of dead leviathans, their massive bones forming natural arches and palaces throughout it. They were easy to spot because the coral formations were especially tall and dense in their vicinity, as though trying to bury any sign of whiteness in the sea of crimson. Sonny, however, had a feeling that the situation was actually reversed. To him, it seemed as though the coral was actually growing out of the old bones and spreading in every direction, slowly consuming the world. When he looked at the crimson mounds surrounding the colossal remains, he couldn't help but see them as rivers of ancient, solidified blood. He was almost sure that if they were to dig deep enough into the black mud to find the roots of the crimson forest, they would find nothing but endless layers of bones. What a scary image. Regardless of what Sonny thought about the nature of the labyrinth, the beast whose remains formed the Bone Ridge was especially large. Thanks to that, a portion of its long spine was tall enough to remain above the water during the night. That's why they had chosen it as the next stop on their journey. With the evening approaching, the next task was crucial. They had to scale the dead Leviathan and make sure that no other creature had decided to take shelter in its remains. If something did, they had no choice but to try and kill it, since there was no time to retreat to their previous safe haven. The last step was often the riskiest. Coming to the base of the coral mound, the group moved around it, searching for a convenient path up. Eventually, they arrived in front of the creature's cracked, misshapen skull, with its lower jaw missing or buried. Under the mud, the upper formed a vast, cavernous cave. Feeling shivers running down his spine, Sonny passed beneath the terrifying palisade of teeth and entered the cave, with his shadow leading the way. They made way to the back of the creature's skull and soon entered the hollow expanse of its spine. Inside the spine, the bone surface under their feet was as wide as a road. Actually, it looked a lot like a highway running through a long tunnel, with stark beams of light falling through the gaps between the massive vertebrae. The tunnel was inclined upward, most of its length hidden behind the bend of the ceiling. When the echo entered the spine, its chitin legs produced a loud, echoing clatter. Nephi's grimaced. Any movement. Sonny checked with the shadow and shook his head. Changing Star looked forward and slightly lowered her chin. Let's proceed. Despite the fact that the shadow had not noticed any danger, they still summoned their swords before moving forward. It was not their first time being ambushed at the edge of safety. Luckily, their precautions turned out to be unnecessary. Nothing was hiding inside the gargantuan remains, so they were able to reach the highest point of the spine without having to cut their way through an unknown number of monsters. By the time they got to safety, the sun was already setting. The dark sea was returning, filling the inside of the sea monster's spine with the echoing sound of rushing water. Sonny took the saddlebags off the echo and dismissed it, making their camp instantly feel much roomier. All three of them were in desperate need of a bath. Leaving the girls alone to give them an opportunity to wash themselves, Sonny walked some distance away and sat down, letting his tired body rest. His shadow returned to the lower parts of the spine, watching the black, dim water slowly rise and devour the ivory whiteness. He had to make sure that nothing would crawl out of the water at the last minute. With half of his mind preoccupied with observing the rising tide, the other half was free to wander. Sonny summoned the runes and checked the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 96/1000. Not bad, he only had 12 at the beginning of all this. In less than a month, the amount increased dramatically. He was stronger and faster now. He was also more experienced. However, that still left him far inferior to even the weakest nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore in terms of raw physical might, even with the help of the shadow. How long before I'm able to wrestle a scavenger with my bare hands? The answer was pretty obvious, not to mention extremely disappointing. Not before his own shadow core had awakened, which could only happen after returning to the real world. Sonny sighed. Soon it was his turn to wash, taking the bottle of endless water from refreshed Rosie Cassie. He walked back to his secluded spot and dismissed the Pupitar's shroud. A cold breeze touched his pale skin, making Sonny shiver. He looked down, shaking his head at the amount of dirt, sweat, and dried blood that was covering his body. Being an awakened was not the cleanest of professions. While he was washing up, Nephi's used the remaining time before nightfall to make a fire and cook some meat. These days, they even had salt to season it. At first, the idea of using the sea salt left behind by the dark sea did not seem very appealing, but after a while, they grew accustomed to it. Salt made every meal they had much tastier. They ate in silence, too hungry and tired to talk. Soon, it was time to sleep. Sonny took the first watch, planning to fit in some sword practice before it was his turn to rest. Going through the motions of the basic kata, he split his mind in two. One part was concentrating on the movements of his body, while the other, smaller part, was observing the surface of the black water. Through his shadow, in the absence of wind, the dark circle covering the lower part of the spine was strangely calm. This was his first time seeing the black water without the constant undulation of waves, with its surface strangely flat and absolutely still. It looked like a giant mirror, one that was made of pure darkness. It was unnaturally mesmerizing. Suddenly, he felt a strong desire to come closer and take a look at his reflection. However, Sonny didn't move. He was terrified of what might look back.